What's up, guys? It's Enigma Hood. And today I'm going to be talking about an interview that TheYoungTurks did with Reza Aslan. And for those of you who don't know, Reza Aslan wrote a book about Jesus. And this guy is a scholar in religion and theology and things like that. He's an expert in Christianity, Islam, and maybe some other religions as well. I think Judaism, of course. And he became kind of popular after the book because he did a interview with Fox News, and these fucking idiots they conducted the worst interview in the history of mankind. They kept on slinging ad hominems at him. They kept on attacking him for being a Muslim and talking about Jesus. They were like, "How dare you talk about Jesus when you're a Muslim?" That's basically all the interview was about. They didn't even talk about the salient points of what the book was even trying to say. It had nothing to do with Jesus. It was all just an attack lambasting this man, this scholar. And he had to point out his credentials over and over again. He has a PhD. He knows what he's talking about. But I don't want to get into that. That's not what this video is about. He finally did a real interview with Cenk from TheYoungTurks, and it was a great interview. But there are some things that this guy says that he makes a couple of assumptions about. And, you know, it's not the kind of approach that a atheist or a neutral person, which is an atheist, would take. So I don't think, well, let's just get right into the video, and I'm going to respond to some of the things that he says.
We have a great interview on TheYoungTurks here for you guys now. It's with Reza Aslan. He is a professor and a scholar, obviously, of the Middle East and of religion. His last book, No God But God, The Origins, Evolution, and Future of Islam, was only considered one of the most important, 100 most important books of the last decade. And so, of course, when he went on Fox News to talk about his new book, Zealot, The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth, they tried to disqualify him because he happens to be Muslim. So that was an awesome moment. Reza, great to have you here with us on the Young Turks.
Thanks for having me.
On the Fox News stuff, I don't want to spend too much time on it, and I actually want to come back to it for a variation of it that I have at the end.
Yeah.
But I really, really want to talk to you about your book, because I'm curious, and I've always been curious about the actual historical life of Jesus and whether it even existed. Now, I've seen some things where they made an interesting argument, let's put it that way, that he was actually a combination of different mythical characters, and there could be a case that he never even existed. So can you put that aside for me as definitively not true?
I think that most scholars would agree that there was a man named Jesus who existed in the first third of the first century A.D. We have, outside of the New Testament, very little information about him, but we do have just kind of a throwaway mention of him written by a Jewish historian named Flavius Josephus in around 94 CE, which is remarkable that anyone would have written about this marginal Jewish peasant. So I think most scholars would say, yes, this man named Jesus of Nazareth existed, but what he said and what he meant, that's all up for debate.
Okay, so did you get that? Raza is saying that Jesus did exist, and he's citing Josephus as his source for proof that Jesus did in fact exist, and he's not just a composite of a bunch of different messiahs who existed at the time. And by the way, Raza goes on later on in this interview to point out that there were tons of supposed messiahs and seditious cult leaders that were cropping up at the time. Now, Josephus, the problem with Josephus is that this man is not a contemporary. Josephus is not a contemporary figure. He wasn't around when Jesus was doing his thing. He wasn't one of the apostles. He wasn't one of his flock. He didn't witness it. He wasn't an eyewitness. He was reporting on hearsay decades after he died, at least 40 years after Jesus allegedly was killed. 40 years afterwards. That's not a contemporary account. That's reporting on hearsay. That's not even admissible in court. If you go to court with that kind of testimony, they're going to throw your ass out of there. You know, with Judge Judy, she doesn't give a shit. She's a no-nonsense woman, remember? If you ever watch those videos on YouTube or on TV, judges do not want to hear a damn thing about hearsay. So why on earth is this historian taking the writings of this man Josephus, seriously, when all he's doing is just reporting on hearsay 40 years ago. How many of you are even 40 years old? That's a lifetime. And if you were an eyewitness, you wouldn't report about it 40 years later, after the fact. You would report about it right on the spot. And you would say, this is what happened, blah, blah, blah. No, he's not doing that. He's just reporting on what other people are saying.
So I've always been tripped out by that, for lack of better phraseology, that the Bible was written so many years after Jesus' life. So how in the world could they have known what he said, given that people weren't writing things down back then? So how did that work?
Yeah, I mean, we have this tendency to think of the Gospels as though they were some kind of eyewitness accounts of Jesus' actions, as though like Matthew, Mark, and Luke were walking around with like a pencil and a piece of paper writing down everything that Jesus said. And of course, that's not the case at all. These were testimonies of faith written by communities of faith many years after the events that they described. The first Gospel, Mark, was probably written around 70, 71 AD, so about 40 years after Jesus died. The last Gospel, John, could have been written anywhere between 100 and 120 AD. And it's also important to understand that these aren't exactly historical documents in the way that we think about them. I mean, the Gospel writers already believed that Jesus was the Messiah or the Son of God or God himself, and then they wrote these Gospels to prove that belief. And so, in a sense, while they're enormously important and valuable for a whole host of reasons, and yes, we can get a little bit of a kernel of historicity out of them, they're not historical documents. They don't really tell us that much about the actual person who walked the earth 2,000 years ago.
Okay, so Reza is being honest here. He is pointing out that the Gospels are not historical at all. The Gospels, which, by the way, we don't know who wrote them. They were not written by Matthew, Mark. We don't know who the hell wrote them. What we do know is that they were written decades, even up to a century after Jesus died. After he died. A century. Imagine 100 years from now, we're going to be like in flying cars in outer space, living in space colonies, stuff like that. So much can happen in 100 years. This stuff was written 100 years after he died. Decades, the earliest one, 40 years afterwards. That's still a long fucking time. And they were all written by people who loved him, who admired Jesus, who just were so infatuated with him. Do you honestly think they're giving an unbiased, impartial account on the man? Of course not. They're never going to say anything bad about him, and they're always going to, like Reza said, they were writing the text to prove their faith. But the writings did not prove a damn thing. They were just writing stuff for their own self-satisfaction, to spread the word about this man that they were infatuated with. It is not a reliable text at all.
You know, as a non-Christian, when I first found out that the Gospels were not written by the apostles, I almost couldn't believe it. And I bet you that a great majority of Christians don't even know that.
Right.
And it's not the 12 dudes who were hanging out with him, but guys who wrote 40 to 120 years later.
Right.
Then that makes me going back to thinking, nah, even if he existed, who cares? They made up all the stuff.
Well, made up is the wrong way to think about it. I mean, look, what you and I call history, the accumulation of facts and dates that are empirically verifiable, is totally a product of the modern age. I mean, that definition of history is like 300 years old at most. The ancient mind would have no idea what you mean when you talk that way. They were not interested in revealing facts. They were interested in revealing truths. So you don't want to think about the Gospels as false. That's the wrong way to think about it, because they wouldn't even understand what you mean. The Gospels are true in the sense that they are meant to impart a deeper truth about who they believed this man was. But insofar as they were trying to sort of write down an objective history of Jesus' words and actions, they wouldn't even know what you mean by that term.
Okay, so he tries to say, and it sounds like he's rationalizing it. He's pandering to Christian emotions and feelings, and we don't want to hurt their feelings, which I can't really blame him for. But he's wrong. He is saying that they weren't reporting on facts, they were reporting on truths. They were not reporting on truths. They were reporting on what they wanted to believe. It's no more reliable than trying to get an account of Osama bin Laden and then going to his Al-Qaeda flock and asking them what they think of him, and to ask them to describe him and his deeds and his actions and what kind of man he is. You're going to get a completely biased account. It's not truth. It is not truth. Not only is it not facts, it's not truth. You're getting a biased account. They're never, ever going to say anything bad about him. They're only going to say good, lavish, great, amazing things about Osama bin Laden. And take the opposite side of that coin, if you go to the Americans, if you go to the American government and talk to some American government officials or whatever, they're going to give you the exact opposite. They're going to give you a biased account on the other side. They're going to say nothing but negative things about him. They're going to just keep bashing him and say what kind of a murderer and scumbag and a terrorist that he is. That's also a biased viewpoint. You're looking at it through another lens. You're not getting an impartial account. And certainly enough, there are some texts out there who had nothing nice to say about Jesus. Okay? They were at least somewhat impartial, and so they said nothing nice about him. They're not going to say all these great and wonderful things about Jesus. So why are you taking the Gospels as truth when they are inherently biased? It's not truth. It's a biased account that has no factual basis, let alone any kind of description about what kind of man Jesus really was. And I'm going to point out the obvious fact here. He was living in an area, Jerusalem, during a time where there was incredible political instability. And not shortly long afterwards, the first Roman-Jewish war broke out. Not surprisingly. But I'll get more into that later.
All right, but you're a historian and a scholar, and as such, do you believe that Jesus actually said the things that are in the Gospels, or do you believe those are the things that they either wished he had said or thought, well, these are things that would be convenient if Jesus had said it, or maybe even thought, hey, I think Jesus said it, I'm not really sure, but it'd be lovely if he did.
Let me give you a perfect metaphor to understand how to read the Gospels and how they were actually written. So again, this is not about revealing facts, it's about revealing truths. What you want to do is say something true about a person by putting it in the guise of a story. That's what the Gospels are. That's how the ancient mind understood these kinds of quote-unquote historical writings. So if I wanted to say something about some guy named Joe I wanted to say that he's a really giving and compassionate person, this is what I would say. One day, Joe walked outside. It was freezing cold. He saw a homeless man on the street without a shirt on, so he took off his own shirt and gave it to the homeless man and walked on. Now, did Joe actually do that? Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. But the question is irrelevant to the ancient mind because you missed the entire point of the story. The point of the story is that Joe is the kind of guy who would take his shirt off of his own back and give it to you. That's how the Gospels were written. You begin with a fundamental truth about Jesus, that he is the anointed one, the Messiah. Later on, that he is God incarnate. And then you write stories whose underlying truth is to prove that notion, but whose facts are just sort of secondary, not relevant. Now, as a historian, we can go in and we can there are little tricks that we can play to figure out what's more likely historically accurate and what's less likely historically accurate. But all in all, you're dealing with something called sacred history, which I've said this 4 times, and I'm going to say it a 5th time because it's such a hard thing for people to get their minds around, which is based on revealing truth, not facts.
Exactly. So even if the particular stories about what Jesus allegedly did are not true, you can't even rely upon them to give an accurate description of what Jesus' personality or character was like, because they're never going to say anything bad about him. It's like going to an Al-Qaeda member and asking him what kind of man Osama bin Laden is like. And he's going to tell maybe a fanciful story about Osama bin Laden, which may not be true, but gives his interpretation of what Osama bin Laden's character is like. And you can't trust that story or that person any more than you can trust the Gospels to give an accurate description of what Jesus is like. Even putting aside the fact that the stories themselves might not be true, you can't even trust the underlying message that it's trying to give.
All right, that's awesome. As an agnostic, my perspective on it is, yeah, not buying it.
And that's fine. That's,
right,
that's
you know what?
perfectly fine, yeah.
From my perspective as a non-believer, I look at that and I think, okay, so there are no facts. And since it's quote-unquote sacred history, it's actually different than real history. In other words, it's not necessarily history. So, I mean, you know, you can say that's biased on my part, but it's hard for an objective person who doesn't believe to see it any differently.
Right.
Actually, Cenk is a much more reasonable man in this situation than Reza is. At least, maybe you could say Reza is pandering to religious sensitivities more. Whatever. But Cenk, he's not being biased at all. In fact, he's being completely impartial and being a very good critical thinker here. That's how you're supposed to approach it. You're not supposed to buy into these stories or even if you put aside the whole factual, whether or not the stories are factual or not, even the underlying message cannot be trusted because it's coming from a biased source. That's the point.
But remember, you keep using this word history as though we all agree what it is. The word history that you just used is only 300 years old. So they would say that this is as true as you would say a history of Napoleon is true. But they're different characters, of course. And again, it's all about making sure that you take the claims of the Gospels and you look at them in light of what we know about the world in which Jesus lived. And while it's true that we know very little about Jesus himself outside of what's written about him in the Gospels, we know a lot about Jesus' world. And that's the whole point of this book, is that you take what little we know about Jesus, that he was a Jew, that he started a Jewish movement, and that he was ultimately arrested as a state criminal and crucified for that movement. You take those three things, you put it in this world that we know so much about because of the Roman occupation. The Romans, it turns out, were pretty good at documentation. And all of a sudden, a picture arises of this man that, well, frankly, bears little resemblance to the picture of the kind of gentle shepherd who turns the other cheek, who's an inveterate pacifist with no care for this world, you know, whose kingdom is of another world. That Jesus, frankly, would have gone unnoticed in first century Palestine.
That's exactly the point here. We don't know that much about Jesus, but we know a lot about the world that he lived in. He lived in Jerusalem during a time of great political turmoil. The Jews were not happy with being ruled by the Romans at all. And he's going to talk about this more later. There were so many instances where people would come up and say that they are going to overthrow the Roman rule, that the Roman rule is destined to fall, and there were lots of apocalyptic movements as well, that the world is going to end, and finally these Roman bastards are going to be defeated. So let's look at probability here. What is the probability that Jesus is really a god compared to the probability that he was just some seditious fucker living in this time where there's great political turmoil? And by the way, very shortly after this period, there was the first Jewish-Roman war. What is the probability that he was just one out of many of these seditious cult leaders who were batshit insane and just espousing to overthrow the Roman Empire and the Roman officials? What is the probability of that compared to him really being God? I would say my money's on him being a nutjob, seditious cult leader. That's just my opinion. What do you guys think?
So, all right, let's put aside the fact that, from my interpretation of what you're saying, is that the guys who wrote the Gospels could have written it about Jesus, could have written it about Bob. Okay, they just picked a name out of a hat of all the different messiahs and said, okay, these are my sacred history that I would like to believe. Okay, put that aside for a second, and I understand what you're saying about that, and I think the audience is clear about what I'm saying on it. when you look at the actual history of Jesus himself, what do we know other than he's Jewish, he's got 12 guys following him around? What else do we know?
Well, by the way, he had a lot more than 12 guys following him around. He had a whole host of men and women who followed him around. But of that group of disciples, 12 of them were special, and they were called the apostles. What we know about Jesus is that he was a poor, illiterate, uneducated peasant who lived in the low hills of Galilee. In other words, he was a nobody. And that's remarkable because what's amazing to think about is that despite this lack of education, lack of access, despite being at the lowest rung of the social ladder in his time and place, he was nevertheless, through his charisma and through the power of his teachings, able to form this movement that was seen as such a threat to the religious and political authorities of his time that he was ultimately arrested, tortured, and executed for it.
That's kind of interesting. Now, who else do we recall that's like that? David Koresh, Shoko Asahara, Jim Jones. What do they all have in common? Well, that's right. They were all losers who came from poverty. They were all uneducated dumbasses who had big egos and wanted to be more than what they were, which was losers. So, are you honestly telling me that Jesus is really God, even though he fits the exact profile, the criminal profile for all of these cult leaders who are really just losers?
So, on the issue of a threat to the state, how common was it for these messiahs, you say that there were plenty of them around back then in Palestine, to be significant enough to be a threat to the state to merit crucifixion? Was that something common, or was it something really rare?
It was actually quite common. We know the names of about a dozen or so other messiahs besides Jesus. Some of them are mentioned in the New Testament. Many of them were actually far more successful in their lifetimes than Jesus was, had way more followers than Jesus did. But if we know the names of 12 of them, you can probably guess that there were 10 times as many that we don't know about. This was an era that was awash in apocalyptic expectation. People really believed that the Roman occupation was something that was an abomination to God. And so one after another, these preachers and prophets and messiahs and bandits and miracle workers showed up promising deliverance from Rome, and every single one of them was killed for doing so. You have to understand that in first century Palestine, simply saying the words, "I am the Messiah," is a treasonable offense. The Messiah means the anointed one. The job of the Messiah is, as the descendant of King David, to recreate David's kingdom on earth, to usher in God's rule on earth. Well, if you're saying to people that I am here to usher in God's rule on earth, what you're saying is that I'm here to usher out Caesar's rule on earth. That's a treasonable offense, and many, many of Jesus' fellow messiahs learned the cost of that kind of sedition.
So what do Christians always say? Oh, he was killed by the Jews because he said that he was the Son of God. He died for our sins. Hello? That's called cognitive dissonance. You're rationalizing. He wasn't killed for that. I don't buy that for a second. He wasn't killed because he said that he was the Son of God or that he died for our sins. No, he was killed because he was a seditious cult leader. I mean, it's no different than like asking an Al-Qaeda guy, why did the Americans kill our buddy Osama bin Laden? Well, of course, they're going to say that, they killed him because he was a prophet. They killed him because he was espousing the word of Allah. They killed him because he was a Muslim. They'll say stuff like that, stuff along those lines, right? But they'll never give you the honest answer. And the honest answer is that because of the 9/11 thing, the honest answer. And the honest answer for why the Romans killed Jesus, assuming he existed, is because he was a seditious cult leader. That's the reason. It's not because of any other reason, or just because he said he was a son of God. And I don't really believe that the Jews had much to say in terms of Jesus being executed. I don't really buy into this anti-Semitic propaganda that's being pushed by a lot of Christians, that it was all on the Jews. I think the Romans wanted to kill him very, very badly. I think they wanted to kill him because he was a seditious cult leader. That's what I think. And it's very, very probable, given the turmoil that was happening around the time. And as you just heard, they were doing this all the time with so many other cult leaders that were seditious, that were trying to overthrow the Roman rule. Of course they're going to do that. Hell, even America would do that. America, look what they're trying to do with Edward Snowden, and he's not even trying to overthrow the American government. They want to torture him. They want to put him in Guantanamo Bay and torture him. Do you honestly believe the Romans are so much better than the American government? Hell no.
Just as he did.
You know, based on the facts that you're telling me, my interpretation of those facts is, yeah, they picked his name out of a hat, and he was just a lunatic wandering around like many other lunatics at the time. So let me go to that question. Is there any reason to believe this particular so-called Messiah, Jesus, believed he was the Son of God and all the other things that have been attributed to him?
Well, let's just get one thing clear here. Son of God is not a description in the Bible. It's a title. Many, many people are called Son of God in the Bible. It's actually a common title. It's a title that you give to kings. So if Jesus ever actually did refer to himself as the Son of God, he meant he was king. Nobody in Jesus' time would have understood that to mean the literally begotten Son of God. That is, the way that became a description instead of a title happened long after Jesus' death. But to your larger question, why is it that, yeah, okay, there were all these other messiahs, and only one of them 2,000 years later is still called Messiah, and we've forgotten about all those other ones? That's a very good question. That's precisely what the book tries to answer. And frankly, the truth of the matter is that it had less to do with anything Jesus himself said or did, though what he said or did was remarkable. It had more to do with what his followers said about him, and the fact that what they did was begin to transform this movement, this deeply Jewish movement, the purpose of which was to free the Jews from the Roman occupation, into a kind of Roman religion. I mean, just the very fact that you're talking about, the idea that Jesus, thought of himself as God. The notion of a God-man is anathema to everything Judaism has ever said about God. If Jesus was a Jew, he would have never called himself God. No one would have even understood what he meant by calling himself God, because it violates 5,000 years of Jewish tradition, scripture, and thought. But you know who's pretty comfortable with the idea of a God-man? The Romans. I mean, Caesar was a God-man. That's not all that weird of a thing. And so by the third or fourth generation of Jesus' followers, as this movement stops being a Jewish movement and starts being a Roman movement, these ideas about Jesus as God incarnate begin to kind of solidify, and Christianity as we know it comes to fruition.
So isn't that interesting? The Romans were the ones who decided to call him the Son of God. Gee, I wonder what that's called. Oh yeah, rationalization. And of course they're never going to blame themselves for killing their new Messiah, their new God. They're going to blame it on the Jews. And they're going to say that we didn't kill him, he died for our sins. Cognitive dissonance, rationalization. They're always rationalizing this stupid shit over and over again so that they don't have any responsibility. They're just going to blame it on the Jews. So it was all their fault. We didn't kill him for sedition. The Jews, they sold him out. We didn't have any choice. We didn't want to kill him. Give me a break. What do you take us for? We're smarter than that. Unfortunately, Christians, they buy into this. They eat it all up. Come on. Just think. It's so obvious. And, so why was Jesus the one that was picked out of all these other guys? Yeah, his followers. Without his followers, he would have been nothing. He would have been nothing. And these guys are so sneaky. Somehow they transformed it from Judaism, a Jewish religion, into the Roman religion. This is the religion that the Romans adopted after Constantine. Constantine was a Christian, and he legitimized Christianity, and then his son made it the official state religion. Oh man, these guys were fucking brilliant. They were stupid as hell, but they were brilliant at the same time. I'm impressed. I wish I could do that.
I'm amused by the idea that 2,000 years ago, they wouldn't believe things as outrageous as, having known almost nothing about science back then, things that are so outrageous, but yet we believe them today. Like if we told them, oh, he's God or the Son of God, they'd be like, come on, man, you're crazy.
Well, it's not so much as that people today would buy into some random guy saying that he's the Son of God. I mean, imagine someone just randomly comes off the street and says he's the Son of God. No one's going to believe him, right? Or if someone says, oh yeah, I am Jesus reborn. No one's going to believe him. For some stupid reason about human beings, we tend to deify the past. We're more willing to accept fanciful, extraordinary shit as long as it happened a long, long time ago. Then we're more willing to suspend our disbelief. And I don't know why they do that. And I don't know why Reza's buying into this either. Doesn't he realize that all this stuff about what the Gospels say is nothing more than the telephone game? It's the same thing with Josephus. The telephone game. For those of you who don't know, the telephone game is just when you have a group of people and you whisper something into one person's ear and then they whisper it to the person sitting next to them, they whisper it to the person sitting next to them, and then it just goes on and on throughout the whole group. And then when it gets to the last person says out loud what they were told, and it will be completely different than what the first person was told, what was whispered into his ear. And that just demonstrates the fallibility of transmitting information through spoken word, through spoken dialogue, through generations. And the game demonstrates so eloquently how bad that kind of information transmission is. This was before the time when Jesus was around and Josephus. This was before paper even existed. This was before paper even existed, so it was even worse. They didn't have any way, they had some ways of writing it down, but they didn't even have fucking paper. And they definitely didn't have worldwide communications. But even today, we hear all kinds of fanciful things, and we very rarely get the real truth of what happened in this part of the country at this particular time, X number of years ago. So Josephus wrote about Jesus 40 years ago, based on hearsay, based off of the telephone game. That's absurd.
Now, again, from my perspective, I'm agnostic. I'm a non-believer. I find all of this stuff wonderful and fanciful and fascinating. But as a historian and a scholar, as you read all of this, how can you still believe any of these religions?
I don't believe in a religion. I believe in God. The only reason that I call myself a Muslim is because the symbols and metaphors that Islam uses to talk about God are ones that I like, the ones that make sense to me. It's not like Islam is more true than Christianity or Christianity is more true than Judaism. They are all equally true, equally valid ways of expressing what is absolutely inexpressible. If you believe that there is something beyond the material world, that there is something that is truly transcendent, then you need some kind of language to talk about it, to make sense of it. That's all that religion is. Anyone who says, I believe in Christianity or I believe in Islam misses the point. Christianity and Islam are not things to believe. They are signposts to God. They are a means to an end, not an end in of themselves.
So this is what I was wondering too. This man is intelligent. He knows what he's talking about. I do think that he's pandering too much, being too kind to religious sensibilities, but he has to. He's a scholar. Whatever. And then the irony, by the way, is that Fox News had the audacity to bash them. Fuck those people. Fuck those fucking hicks. Anyway, the point is that he believes in God for emotional reasons. He believes in God because he wants to believe in God. And that's an irrational position to have. And I really wish more people would realize that they're just making an appeal to emotion fallacy. Didn't I say before in my other video that I wish there was a moral judge? Even I wish there was a real moral judge. Not the one from the Bible. Not the God of the Bible. That's not a moral judge. That's an evil monster. A real moral judge. I would love for that to be true. One that punishes rapists, murderers, people who abuse animals. I would love that. And rewards good people. And is consistent. However, my desire for a moral judge is independent of reality. And that's what we need to recognize. That we can't just believe in stuff because we want it to be true. That's fallacious thinking. Anyway, that's all I have to say about this. Post in the comment section about what you think, about what you thought about this interview. I think Cenk did a good job. He calls himself an agnostic, but, he's really an agnostic atheist, but that's a different story. Anyway, this is Enigma Hood signing off.